Welcome to Reclamation, a beEmboldened initiative where we focus on living out freedom from spiritual abuse. If this is your first time listening in, I'm Naomi Wright. I'm the founder and executive director here at beEmboldened. And if you've been here for a while, this is our first episode in a while. I took a break, I think, starting around the end of October. I'm excited to be back. We have some great conversations lined up, starting with this first one with Dr. Bobby Conway. I'm going to give you a little intro to him, and then we can go ahead and jump right in the conversation. But I want to share, I've been excited to record with him for a while because he's doing things differently in terms of church and mental health. And I think you're going to be into it. So I'm excited for you to listen to this conversation. So Dr. Bobby Conway, he started as a co-host of a nationally syndicated radio program called The Pastor's Perspective and the radio show Unapologetic, in case anyone's heard of that. He's also the founder and host of 1 Minute Apologist, which is where I initially started hearing from him. It's a YouTube ministry that provides credible answers to curious questions. And he's also the founding leader now of Image Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. And this is really like what I want to talk about today. He earned his master's of theology from Dallas Theological Seminary. He's doctor of ministry and apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary, and his doctor of philosophy from the University of Birmingham in England. He's also the author of several books, including the most recent one that we touch on in this conversation, Does Christianity Still Make Sense? So with that, he's married since 1996. He has 2 grown children. He's a family guy. He has been through it, y'all. And the way he is bringing his past into what he's doing in his church, again, is really cool. I think it sounds great, groundbreaking compared to what I've seen and heard. So again, I'm excited for you to check it out. Bobby, I've been following you since 1 Minute Apologist. Like, that's when I first became aware of Bobby Conway and the work that you were doing. And then my husband is actually the one who brought to my attention that you had planted a church with your wife. And he had noticed, I don't remember what it was that he picked up on initially, but he noticed that you care about mental health. You recognize the reality, you recognize the importance. And he noticed that it was a part of what you were bringing into your church plant, was this acknowledgement and the support of mental health. So he came to me and he was like, Naomi, like, you've got to talk to Bobby because I think you guys have some common interests, like, for the church and recognize a common need. So that's how I was prompted to actually reach out and be like, hey, can we chat about this? So, well, I do want to bring in some aspects of your most recent book, which I'm excited to do because you talk about some of this in the book as well. I also am curious about some of what you're doing at your church. So it's going to be a little bit of a hodgepodge for a conversation.
Sounds great.
Okay. Great. Well, I'm going to jump into the first question and get us going. So many who come to beEmboldened for support, they've had significant struggles with mental health. Yes, they've experienced spiritual abuse. That is the area that we focus within. Attached to that, there can be all kinds of things. And it's not always strictly, in fact, I would say it's most commonly not strictly spiritual abuse. There are other forms of abuses that people have experienced. And so all of this is, of course, playing into their mental health. Many, though, depending on the type of experience they've had, they've been told that mental health is more of this secular idea and that licensed professionals cannot be following the Bible if they're using any knowledges from the sciences. So it really is cutting off that area of support. So I'm curious, as a pastor, what's your position on this?
I look at the idea of mental health as something that a lot of the church is starting to catch up with and recognize that there is an issue, but this is dramatically improved, I think, is a recognition since COVID. I think that there's a lot of work to be done still. I've often said that the church tends to make everything a moral issue and the culture tends to make everything a mental health issue. And sometimes it's both, sometimes it's one or the other, and therefore it requires discernment. But if we fail to recognize a mental health component in the church, then what will happen is we will make everything a moral issue, which could lead to shame and isolation and a lack of feeling safe and vulnerable in the church. And when it comes to the culture, if we make everything a mental health issue without recognizing morality, well, then we'll shun responsibility, we'll be victims, and we'll never recognize wrongdoing. And I think the church is seated in a position to recognize both. And I don't think that we're hard pressed to see mental health issues in the Bible. at all. I think you can sense depression and paranoia. You can sense fear and anxiety. Now, the question then becomes, at what point do some of these things turn into a moral issue? So if somebody has anxiety in life, when does their anxiety disorder become sinful? Or when does somebody's depression turn to just a lack of trust in God? So that does require attunement to the person. It requires knowledge of kind of understanding the psyche. But what we do at the church is we often stress that we need to meet people where they are. I mean, that's what God does with us in the Bible. He meets us where we are to bring us to where He is. And we shouldn't be naive enough to think that just because somebody walked into our church, that by osmosis, they're going to carry our brand, our philosophy, our theology. We need to recognize that everybody that came through our doors has come, and they are the result of the mentors they've had, the traumas they've had, the books they've read, the teachers they've had, the experiences, their beliefs. All of that shaped the person. And when we recognize that a person is to be treated not just as a sinner in need of redemption, but as an entire being, well, then that broadens our approach to deal with the person more holistically, and I think more in a healthy fashion.
Absolutely. And I was thinking as you were sharing, just loving well, it enables us to actually love someone well, which is going to include accountability when it's needed. And it's going to include that, again, kind of more tuned in support of what's actually going on. I think we miss the mark. I mean, even when I'm coming alongside someone, I consider, like, is there something medically going on where a referral would be needed in that regard? Or is it mental health? Or is there confusion about something biblically? Or is there a shying away from accountability? And so really, it takes getting to know the person and slowing down. And I think that relationship sometimes gets passed over too quickly. Like, it's more of, let's get to the quick fix and how do we address the issue? And we don't necessarily get to know the person and really what's behind the issue. And that is going to require that we take more time. And that is something I consider to be very pastoral. So depending on what someone's background is and what their role is, they may veer more towards that or they may not. But I think it's a really important part. So definitely something I would be looking for in a pastoral team, whether it's, lead pastor, senior pastor, or someone else on the team. That is the main connecting point. But definitely for sure, something that I love to see.
One of the things, Naomi, I mean, my wife and I put together a crash course, How to Heal for Real. People could see that at ChristianityStillMakesSense.com. We've used that and pieces of it in the church. It's one of the values of our church to help people. So we mention it from, the host does on stage pretty much every week. We show a video a month on Sunday. My wife does a mental health wellness Wednesday video that goes out. We've taken people through different books like by Pete Scazzaro, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. So we are really trying to be proactive in this way. And then the other thing is we're really trying to partner with a local counselor and trying to get wisdom of how to create a culture that can meet the different tiers. And so if you have lay level, then pastoral, and then professional, teaching people how to discern, know when to pass the baton off to an expert. All of this is really crucial. We've been influenced by Jim Wilder's Life Model Works, and he's a neurotheologian, and he has an entire plan that can be really suitable for the church. Now, I would differ from him, like where he is reductionistic as it relates to reducing, the brain and the mind to be the same thing. And I think that we've got a spiritual soul. So that would be a point that we differ on. And being a Christian apologist puts my sensitivity up extra there. But I do think that there's a lot of resources that are out there, and we're just trying to craft new ground and figure out what this looks like for us as we chart ahead.
So this is unusual, big picture, right? Like for pastors to be, and I'm not picking on pastors. I love the church, and I've got some great friends who are pastors. I've met incredible pastors. This is more of like been slower to come in, which makes sense. I get it. But I'm wondering why it's so important to you, like maybe even on a personal level, if you're open to sharing a bit. I know, again, that you do in your book, but like, how did this come to be so important that it's this integrated into your church model?
You know, Naomi, I didn't hear the gospel till I was 19, and I grew up and had a lot of consequences at my own dysfunction. But I can remember from a young age sitting in class and my hands would be just sweaty and I just felt so much anxiety. But I didn't know how to talk about that. Like there wasn't like emotional checkups from mom and dad on what's going on, how are you feeling, what are you thinking about, and I didn't really know what I was struggling with, but I had a tremendous amount of anxiety. And then when I turned 15, I started turning to alcohol and drugs and promiscuity, and that kind of assuaged that for a little bit. But I started to collect consequences as a result to those add-ons. And by, creating these additions to my life, that just further traumatized and created more anxiety. Well, then I became a Christian and I thought, well, this is great. I can now get forgiven for all these things that I've done wrong. And I got really zealous, took my addict personality, threw it into Jesus. I mean, I was a guy, I fasted for 40 days, fasted for 20 days, fasted for 10 days, witnessed to 50 to 100 people a week. I mean, I was sold out, but I still felt anxious. And then it was reductionistic. I was told it's just spiritual warfare. The enemy's trying to take me back. And I go, there was a lot of spiritual warfare. But then it just sat there, and I had a psychologist at Dallas Seminary say, I think you got an anxiety disorder. You should get on some medication. And I thought, boy, that's going to make me weak. And so I decided not to do that. I probably went another 10 years. Then I started to sink into depression. I was in doubts. And I got to a place where the despair was so bad that I did get open to antidepressants. And that was helpful. I had a counselor say, Bobby, picture yourself drowning out in the middle of a lake. And you got to swim to shore, and you just can't make it. You're going to drown. All this does is throw you a life vest so that you can feel like it's possible to swim to shore. And so it did that for me. It allowed me to feel like I could get to shore. I still had to do the work, but I felt like I didn't have to take a gun to my head because I couldn't cope any longer. And then I ended up having a relapse after 23 years of sobriety. In a dark night of the soul, I was struggling as a father, watching a son in despair with depression. I was just so empty. And unfortunately, I guess got to say, Jesus wasn't enough for me in this moment. And he should have been, right? Like that. But he just wasn't. And they say in AA, if you got a gun in one hand or a bottle in the other, take the drink. In other words, if you get to a point where you think your only solution in life is to take your life or to take a drink, well, take a drink. And so I ended up back in recovery, but the response of the leadership of the church was so abysmal to my relapse that when I ended up resigning, and I wasn't forced to resign at all. In fact, I was encouraged not to, but there was such a lack of love in the way they handled it by just seeing the moral side of it. Instead of like, Bobby, you must be feeling a lot of shame right now after 23 years of walking clean. We can talk about like the relapse here, but let's talk about what do you think contributed to it? What was going on in your psyche? Because we don't want you to do this again, and we want to make sure we come alongside of you. Instead, it was like, we got to tell the church, we got to figure this out. And it was just a complete exposing. And if it wasn't for the grace of God, I could have really went down a horrific trap with that. And so when we pulled away, we said, we need to start a church. We were in the midst of COVID that is attuned to people's mental health, because the church is called to be a healing center, not a shaming center. And we felt so much shame coming out of that we said, we have to be the kind of people that meet people where they are. And even if it is a moral issue, they still need a hug. They still need to know what grace looks like. And so that's kind of my backdrop into the passion of that. My wife struggles with anxiety. Our daughter has some OCD tendencies, our son with depression. And then I've got the wonderful gifted cluster of anxiety, depression, some OCD tendencies, and addiction. And then trying to just live with that. And then you get people with fully on left brain saying, oh, you just got to get over it. You just got to pray more. You just got to do that. I'm like, well, you know what? If it was only so simple,
I wish.
some people are born into this world where the volume is turned up louder on their emotions than others. And if the volume's too loud, you'll go nuts inside your own head looking for a way to assuage it.
So for all of you who will be listening to this, I bet if I could ask everyone, like, raise your hand if you would like to move to be a part of Bobby's church, everyone would be raising their hand.
Let's do it.
Right? Because what you're saying, it's so true, and it's refreshing, and it's really needed. Thank you for your transparency. I mean, for you to be so upfront about what you have experienced, where you have suffered, where you have struggled, where you have championed as well, may I add, is just really incredible to hear and be able to share with others. And whether it is and whether it is a substance or it is something else, again, for all of you who are going to listen, plug in whatever that is for you. And please consider how to apply this for your life. And this is the kind of community that I think a lot of us need and have needed and have just struggled to find. So I hope that there's hope in this for all of you, that it does exist. It can be found. And I want to jump into your most recent book. I know you mentioned the title already, Does Christianity Still Make Sense? And you shared in chapter 4 that you struggled with doubt. You were told to just read your Bible more. And I know that you just spoke to this a little bit. And it does sound similar to what we hear oftentimes when we're talking about spiritual abuse, which is to just have more faith, just have more faith, and that's going to fix everything. And so I know you just shared, you kind of dropped that a little bit. Why are these sentiments unhelpful or sometimes flat out wrong? Like, if you were going to encourage someone right now, kind of your short, like 30 seconds or less. And for anyone who was not here before I started recording, he mentioned that he could give an answer in 30 seconds or less. So I'm not being rude. I'm not trying to make you be quiet, Bobby. But what would be like your short little takeaway for someone of like, here's my encouragement that I should seek support. I should consider that I might actually need some help with this. That's okay.
Well, the Bible is clear. Be merciful to those who doubt, in the book of Jude. And I do think that the church can give a lot of trite answers to people's problems. I think that they often mean well, or perhaps they've never had the struggle themselves, so they're not really a part of the circle of empathy that they need to be for that moment. But recognizing that the person who is going through a dark night of the soul with doubt is anguishing. If they had a close walk with Jesus, they feel like that's being stripped away. And now they're questioning if they've been duped. And that can create a lot of instability in a person's life. And if the person's struggling, maybe the person needs to read their Bible more. Again, I'm for reading the Bible. I, read several chapters already today. But my problem became, I was getting messed up reading some of the passages in the Old Testament. And I was going, well, how do I reconcile this? How do I make sense of this? And so I just think sometimes when someone's doubting, asking questions, what's contributing to it, figuring out what is it you've done so far to try to deal with this. And then instead of just a fast response, look to give them a customized response based upon what's really going on.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm going to segue us a little bit into talking more about church leadership. I know so far I've just kind of mentioned you as a pastor, and you share quite a bit in your book about leadership and different things that happen in the church, like scandals in the church and things related to that, of course. And that's certainly something that we talk about a lot here at beEmboldened, coming alongside people who have experienced injustices like this. So we know that someone claiming to be Christian does not mean that they're making choices that are congruent with this claim. So considering this alongside the biblical character requirements for leadership that we see in 1st and 2nd Timothy, as well as in Titus, would you have any suggestions for how we can assess the legitimacy of the leaders we're choosing to learn from? And to put that in a different way, basically what I'm getting at, Bobby, is it's really hard to get to know the character of leadership. When you go into a church and you're checking out, we have a lot of people who are going to be stepping into church for the first time after a really long time away because they've taken time to heal and get their feet under them. And they're wanting to give this a go again and find a solid, safe church community, landing in that imperfect area, not in the abusive area, is how I talk about it. Like, we want to be in the imperfect bucket, not the abusive bucket, and learning how to decipher, distinguish between those two. So when we're trying to assess the character of leadership, again, that's kind of hard to do, particularly if it's a bigger church. And so maybe that's a factor, is to stay away from a bigger church. I don't know. So I'm curious, what would your thoughts be on that?
So I think that you're right. I mean, it is tough. You can look at those traits, but then we've all seen people who have passed that smell test, and then, there's a fall. I think we could maybe start with recognizing that any leader has the potential to fall because they're sinners. And so we got to remember that when we are looking for a church, we want leaders that point us to Jesus, that point us to truth, and they're not obsessed with themselves. We want to find that in our approach to finding a church, that we're realizing that any time a leader or a person can let us down. And that's why we got to keep anchored in Jesus. And then knowing that, I would say, okay, this person's already a pastor. So apparently they've got past Titus 1 and 1 Timothy 3. And so what do we do with that? Okay, well, then I would start paying attention to the culture. And I would look for the ability for the pastor to share power, because many pastors are power hungry. And that is a dangerous, dangerous recipe when a pastor is addicted to power. People, we all have a propensity toward idols. And I've shared with the flock, like, pleasure is the thing that I always have to watch out for if I'm in pain. I'll say, if I'm in a lot of pain, temptations to take a massive bong hit can come over me pretty big. Now, you're not supposed to say that as a pastor. But the moment I say, well, don't you have a temptation when you're in pain? Like, maybe it's to eat a lot, or maybe it's to lash out, or maybe it's to dominate others. Mine just happens to be, I'll think in terms of whiskey or an escape. And I recognize that that's wrong. That's not what I want to do. I need to be aware, though, of my shadow and how it can sneak up on me. Well, when I look at a church, if I see a leader that has to control everything, if I see a leader that doesn't delegate, that can't share, if I see a leader that people are intimidated by, then we have a problem that I think that would cause me to want to stay clear. A leader that comes off overly self-righteous, that can't acknowledge his wrongs, that doesn't seem to be attuned to his own shadow, that seems to be the person who's the cure-all, be-all, end-all, fix-it-all, a person that presents himself as the one who can have all the solutions. That stuff makes me nervous. Like, I don't want to be in a church where, like, I don't agree with everything at our church, and I started it. And that's because in order for us to be a church family, it means that other people have to be a part of building a culture. And frankly, I don't agree with myself from one day to the next sometimes. So how in the world could I expect to agree with everybody else? And so I think there has to be teachability, humility, recognition of weakness, sharing of leadership. That kind of stuff goes a long ways. And leaders that are power hungry and unhealthy and toxic, you can sense it in the staff culture. You can sense it in the abuse of the way he operates. And so those would just be some of the things that I would look to.
You move into, in your book, talking about systemic issues. And so I'm curious, would you share some of your thoughts on that? So what do you see as the systemic issues that lend itself to abuse and scandals within the church?
I think that there can be certain aspects where a leader over time loses his way because of a familiarity with the sacred, and you start to just take it for granted. I can even see in my own life at times, like where early on, where I didn't have wisdom, I prayed about everything. But there can be a danger, because the longer you walk with the Lord, you can gain more wisdom, and then you can begin to trust in the wisdom and lean on prayer less. I think about Joshua and the Gibeonites. In the book of Joshua, the Gibeonites, they were supposed to be taken out in the conquest, but they deceived Joshua into going into a pack by acting as if they've traveled long and far, and they show up with these clothes that look like they had not been washed in ages, and food that looked like it was decaying. And what Joshua did in that moment is he realized, he said, oh, yeah, you have traveled long and far. Sure, we'll make a pact to protect you. And the words come to him, Joshua, had you prayed, you would have known you were being deceived. So what Joshua did in that moment, I call it the Gibeonite principle, is he did what looked to make sense from just a wisdom standpoint, but he lost sight of the spiritual principle of prayer. And that is a story that reminds us that no matter how wise it might seem to make the move, we should always ask God and depend on God. And so I do think that people get to lose their way. They just start doing what makes sense. They get slippery in the moral department. They start minimizing things. They start thinking, oh, what's the big deal if someone's going doctrinally astray a little bit? And what's the big deal if someone morally compromises a bit? They start being informed more by culture. And then, like the book of Judges, before you know it, everyone's doing right in their own eyes. And the pastor's lost sight that his whole calling to begin with was to call people out of the culture to focus on the Lord so that they could better reach the culture when they're engaged with him.
That connects with something else that I think about. Well, I was going to say periodically, but I think actually pretty often is, part of what I think can lend itself to landing in that headspace that you just shared of like, okay, I'm using wisdom, using knowledge, using training and things like that, which are all good things, of course, like you said. And yet, leaving out the prayer component and that the Lord knows the result of the decision we're going to make. We don't yet know that. And so I think getting too busy and having too much on our own plates can lead us to that place. And it's something that I remind myself of often is, ministry is going to happen at the pace of the Lord's, like it's going to happen at his pace because there's only so much that we can take on and that we can do prayerfully and healthily. And so there could be so many opportunities, but we can't take all the opportunities. Like so much more growth maybe could happen in ways, but we're not going to be able to necessarily see all of that in our lifetime. And maybe we do because the Lord shows up and does amazing things that we're like, well, I sure as heck didn't pull that off. But I think I've seen a connection there too. I know I've felt it myself when it's like, gosh, my to-do list is so long. I'm more apt to just rely on knowledge that I have versus taking the time to be prayerful about a decision.
Yeah, that's well said, Naomi. And busyness is definitely something to pay attention to. I literally got to the point where I did burn out, and they say most people can't make it back. And I didn't know that I could. But, you can burn out doing good things, just because you don't know how to say no, or you feel bad. Maybe you're acting codependent. Maybe you want a bigger platform. Maybe your ego's getting in the way. There's all kinds of things that can distract us as leaders, and busyness. Look, Satan, if he can't get you out of the ministry, then he'll seek to make you so busy with the ministry that you'll do anything to get out of the ministry. And so we need a filter in our life for saying yes to and no to. We need to have a focus so that when people ask us for opportunities that are outside of, what we're doing, we're able just to say, I'm just trying to stay on point here. And that can be really helpful. And periodic checkups, like tomorrow, I'm going to meet with my counselor, and I go to a counselor. It was monthly. Now it's once every other month, but I just look at this as attunement. Like I'm doing really well right now, but I don't want to wait to have to go, till I slide out. So it's more of like the whole point is, hey, let's just talk about how the last few months have been and what I see coming. And it's all about just saying, look under the hood of my life to help me to see if there's anything shadowy brewing that I need to be aware of.
That's excellent. And there's an inside saying amongst
support professionals that when a client shows up and they don't have anything to talk about, you're going to have the best session you've had in a long time because there isn't a fire to put out. So you actually have time to see what else has kind of been under there, like you're sharing. So I love that you do that. Yeah, it's such a good practice. So I remember being taught, and I want to note because I was raised in a polygamous doomsday cult. So, I've got a background, but this is not where I was taught this. So I want to note that for our listeners, because you might be like, oh, well, that's how she was raised. It was crazy. But no, I was taught this in a non-denominational, like mainstream church when I came out of that in my 20s. So I was told that basically hypocrisy is normal. And Bobby, this didn't even register with me that I had been taught this until I was listening to your book, because I did listen to it on Audible. So I was listening to your book and I'm like, you know what? I've kind of had this sort of stuff down. Have I lived into it in any way? Let me think about that. I want to take a look at it. Where did this come from? And so I was taught that everyone is hypocritical sometimes. So it's basically not such a big deal. What do you think about that?
I do think that everybody's hypocritical from the standpoint that none of us live up to the standard that we profess to live up to. But as Christians, it's more consequential. So if somebody says, oh, I can't be a Christian because of the hypocrisy, we can say, hypocrisy is not merely a Christian problem. It's a human problem. Where you have humans, you have hypocrisy. Every business, every religion, every sport, everywhere you look, you'll find hypocrisy. Politicians. In the church, it becomes more glaring because we are desiring to live up to what Christ called us to, yet it's always in our face because we can't do it. And so I think that hypocrisy, though, doesn't mean that every Christian is actively living as a hypocrite, because I think if you start from the standpoint of saying something like, I would be a hypocrite if I was saying I was doing one thing and doing another, but I'm just recognizing that I can't live up to this standard in and of myself. And that's why I do need Jesus. And if there is a moment where I'm hypocritical, and that can come out in our marriage, it can come out in so many areas where, we think we're doing one thing and we got the log in our eye. But I do think it's so helpful for us just to point people to a Jesus that he too hates hypocrisy. And that's why he died on the cross for our sins and he paid for our hypocrisy. And he shows us a way to remedy the situation. But he was the strongest against those that were hypocrites, that were just walking around in self-righteous attitudes, because he saw how destructive that was to the believing community.
Mm. Yeah, I like how you just summarized that combination of it just really, I think, touches on what seemed wrong to me about the way this was taught. It went a step too far of normalizing it to the point of, meh, it's fine. And yet, again, when I was reading in your books, like, well, no, Jesus, gosh, did I write this down? I think I may have wrote this. I'm not sure if I have this as an exact quote or not, so I won't say it's a direct quote. It might be. I might be quoting you. Jesus reserved his sharpest criticism for hypocrites, the Pharisees who honored God with their lips, but not with their hearts. So again, I'm not sure if that's a direct quote or if I paraphrased it, but basically saying, yes, like there are times we're going to be hypocritical, and yet our goal is to not be. And we also have a goal of not excusing it. And I think kind of what we're landing on, let me know if you would agree or disagree with this, there can be levels to it. Does that make sense? There can be degrees of it being problematic. Not that we want to let it slide, but it can be a bigger problem in some areas maybe than in others at times.
Sure. I mean, we're all familiar with what happened with Ravi Zacharias. I mean, sure. That was an example of just gross hypocrisy. I mean, traveling around the world, calling people to Jesus, and yet living this duplicitous life that left so many people confused. And what made that even more confusing was the meekness by which he lived and presented his life. And so that disillusioned a lot of people. But if somebody says, I left my faith because of, someone else's hypocrisy, you got to question whether they ever really had a faith, because if we can leave our faith off of a leader messing up, well, then our faith was not rightly sourced in Jesus. It was too much in the leader and not enough in Jesus. So while we can be disillusioned, Jesus and the scriptures went to great lengths to help us to understand that we have a sin problem and we shouldn't be disillusioned by other people's sin. In fact, the whole statement of Jesus dying on a cross, it's him hanging, dying for the world, saying, you guys are messed up, very sinful, and I love you so much and I'm here to die for you. So we shouldn't be shocked when people sin and they get off track. But what makes it egregious, I think, is when we act like we've got it all together and we know. I think of a guy that just was arrested in our church. It's public news. I've never had anything like this in my ministry where we had somebody who was a pedophile get arrested. But this guy's at the men's group just a couple weeks ago, and now he's sitting behind bars because he was molesting his adopted daughter. And it came to surface, and now his wife is divorcing him, and this guy's getting ready to go to prison. And I'm thinking, yeah, he's just, showing up at church and acting like everything's together and all this is going on. And this stuff is going to create confusion, unfortunately, for people. But our hope isn't in this person. So when somebody sins and they're a hypocrite, guess what? It requires a standard for hypocrisy to exist to begin with. And so at least we're recognizing that there is a good that has been violated. And so on atheism, what is hypocrisy if there's no such thing as a real objective moral standard anyway?
Right? All right, come on. 1 minute apologist. Go for it. There you go. You're getting into it. There's the apologetic defense right there. You're right. Yeah, like we do have to have a standard for it. And so when we're recognizing something's wrong, there has to be a standard for what's right and what's wrong. Absolutely. And your advice for anyone tempted to excuse a leader's immoral behavior, you include acknowledging the behavior. Again, this is going back to, does Christianity still make sense? So you include acknowledging the behavior, following biblical protocol, and not assuming that God will excuse the hypocrisy. So I want to tune in, or kind of hone in, I guess would be a better way to say it, into Matthew 18 right now, because when we're following biblical protocol, Matthew 18 is incredibly commonly used by abusers to get rid of people who are challenging them. It is easily the most abused verse I've heard used in the Bible. Again, working within the context of people who've experienced spiritual abuse, it comes up in almost every conversations, and I've had thousands at this point. So church discipline, both for leaders and members, is important. Yet I do hear stories after story about it being ignored in one direction or another, or being over applied with a really heavy hand, and sometimes, again, like total abuse. So Matthew 18 gets really, really, it gets messy. So I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts on how to bring clarity to this passage and to safeguard against the misuse of it for those who will be listening to this?
Well, what's interesting is the church hasn't even started yet, Matthew 18. So when we call it church discipline, the church doesn't even begin until Acts chapter 2. So this was the way that they were operating under the old covenant. I do think you can extract the principles of engagement, but I don't like the term church discipline. We don't use that as much as church restoration, and I don't like the term accountability partner as much as I like deep friendship, because if you see that if you mess up and now the church is going to discipline me, or if I have just accountability partners, then that relationship can almost just be framed up around challenging each other's sin. And that's a very myopic look at relationship, because again, we are more than just sinners, right? I mean, we have a lot of other things in life to talk about. And so, yes, I would like the accountability in the context of a friendship. I'm going to trust somebody to engage my life more when I feel like we have more than just sitting in judgment of each other and having accountability checkups, so we actually care about each other. I'm going to be more apt to feel safe to be open up to be open and real about my sin in a church if I feel like they want to restore me, not just discipline me. Now, some would listen and go, well, the whole purpose of discipline is restoration. I get that, but I like to start with the end rather than the means. Discipline's the means to the end, which is restoration. And I'd rather give the vision of what this is about, restoration, than focus on the means. And so it's like the purpose of discipline is just to correct, to help. And so what I think we want to be able to do is when somebody messes up, you have people that are automatically just broken up about it. And you don't have to do as much there. I mean, they're just humble. They just need to have someone come alongside of them and walk with them. And if somebody's humble and they're in church leadership, they'll even recognize that, hey, I might need to step back, or I might need to have some space from this. If somebody's hard-hearted about it, well, then that might require a different approach. But I do think asking questions when somebody messes up, how did you get here? Because when you're asking questions, you'll get a sense of how broken the person is, what led to it. And then you can start to figure out what the best approach is. But I think there's not a one size fits all approach to this stuff because people are unique and there's always situations that look different. So for example, like you read about marriage, you can't get divorced unless there's adultery. And then Paul comes along, right? And he adds that, well, yeah, but if you're married to a non-believer and a non-believer leaves. And then I find myself thinking, more of like a wisdom model. Like I think that was true unless there's adultery. But then I sit there and I go, well, there's certain situations. What would I tell somebody that comes into my office and the wife's with a man, but now the man thinks he's a woman and he went and had his genitals taken off, but he still wants to be married to her, but he's never had an affair on her? Should I say, well, you know what? Jesus said, unless you commit adultery, but now she's saying, but he walks around in a dress with me and we go out on dates. Well, okay, now I can see another situation. Or what about the person who gets married, but then the person, was doing something just egregious and now he's going to prison for the rest of his life. Maybe he was taking lies. Maybe he's a serial killer and he'll never get out. Do I say, well, he never had an affair on you, so now you're bound to him until the rest of your life while he serves? So I go, there's some common sense stuff. And again, if you don't figure out the whole context, we won't know how to nuance what we have to do when we're dealing with people.
Yeah, just reminded me of a conversation I had recently where the husband tried to strangle her. And there was literally, she's getting told you have to stay with him. It's like, geez. Dear Lord, we have missed the point.
Yes.
We've completely missed the point. Yeah. So,
and some people would think we're liberal for saying this. And I used to be that way, but then I thought, oh my goodness, this is, you're just going to tell somebody that the husband's physically beating her that, then I get the concerns that there's more than just that we don't want to compromise, but I think you're compromising to leave somebody in a compromised position of physical abuse. And then what? Yes, just say, spend the rest of your life just to say that you're married just for the sake of I didn't break a covenant. So there's a lot more I could say here because I could already anticipate the objections, but I'll sit in it.
I think you'll get less of them from this audience. So I think you're safe. So I want to ask one last question, and this is going to be again in regards to the hypocrisy. You shared that just because some Christians overlook or tolerate hypocrisy doesn't mean that God will, that God also judges passivity as sin. And this could probably be a whole conversation on its own. But what are your thoughts on people who know that someone has experienced abuse, yet they continue to attend the church, so show support in ways for the abuser, basically avoid speaking up, taking a stand? They kind of just move forward like, not my issue, or I don't really know what to do with it. And I can understand where people can have questions. Maybe they have follow-up, but maybe they're not actually digging in to get those follow-up questions answered. I hear this question a lot from people, again, who come to beEmboldened. They've experienced spiritual abuse. It is definitely, big things have happened. Not where we're like, oh, someone got their feelings hurt. No, we're talking actual abuse has occurred. And they're like, gosh, all my friends are still attending the church and they know what happened. Are they being complicit? Is that sin? How do I navigate this? So I'm curious if you have any thoughts here.
So we do have a responsibility to speak up. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, the scripture says. It's important that if you see something happening that is harming the body of Christ, that we speak up in love. But I think we can approach it as it depends on the gravity of the action. So, like when my wife traveled around with me, we did Weekend to Remember family life conferences for marriages. And one of the statements that I often said is I said, confront the pattern, not the isolated event in marriage. If you confront every isolated event, you're just going to feel like a nitpicker and you're going to wear each other out. But if you confront the pattern, not just the isolated event, well, that shows that you've been patient. It shows that you're being thoughtful. And then when you do talk, you're more concerned about a character that has been formed. I think similarly in the church, when a leader does something, if it's not drastic, you just tuck it away. And if he does it again, you might kind of just go, But I'd say when you start seeing a pattern of mistreating people, I think you could say, I live by a philosophy of confronting the pattern, not the isolated event. I saw this the first time. I saw it the second time and I tucked it away. But now I'm seeing this and I'm only sharing this because I don't know if you're aware how this is coming off. And I don't even know if you're meaning to do it, but I think it's unhealthy as an approach. And I think that that's what can happen. If somebody does something egregious that needs to be dealt with, then you can't wait for a pattern. If somebody's physically abusing somebody,
Right.
You just got to deal with it. But there are things sometimes where we could be wrong too. Like we might think somebody was off, but it could just be that we were off. And so if it's more minute, by waiting for a pattern to emerge, then we can start to address some of the things that we don't want to become part of our culture, the fabric of it. And I think that when we do confront, we can do it in love, out of concern that, hey, the reason I'm coming after this third time, it's because, it's been building and I don't want to see this. I don't want people looking at you this way. I don't want the church to get misrepresented this way. Being humble, because we're all capable of that. I mean, I had a person once, Naomi, go, what scares you the most about being a pastor? What do you fear the most? And outside of God, I just looked at the person and said, well, myself. And I mean, that's the thing I think, okay, I'm 51 now. I've done a pretty good job of jacking my life up along the way so far. If I live 30, 40 more years, how am I not going to just get out of alignment again? And I have to be careful to not let my anxiety get in the way of all the future contingencies that I could create for myself by saying, just live one day at a time. So in other words, my ability to understand just how much I'm capable of blowing it helps me when I'm dealing with others to realize we're all in the same boat in need of a savior. And we need to be pointing people and reminding people of the gospel. And it's for his sake we do what we do anyway.
So having touched on some various issues and messes that we see in the church, as well as that we see in ourselves, does Christianity still make sense?
I think it does. And I went through that long, drawn out, dark night of the soul, wondering if I was going to walk away from it all. And I came to a place where what was so beautiful, Naomi, is it wasn't, all the studies and everything that I had done through my obsession to learn and grow. The funny thing about it is the way out of my doubt was the same way into my faith to begin with. It turned out to be a simple trust in the historical evidence and reliability of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And I learned to embrace faith like a child again. And, I realized that for all of my issues in life, a gospel-centered life, if I'm bitter at somebody, I need to remember the gospel. If I'm struggling to love somebody, I need to remember the gospel. If I'm losing my way, I need to remember that Jesus is the way. And I think that there's such a beauty to the simplicity of living a gospel-centered life. It's so simple, yet so profound that it's amazing to me how many days I forget to just, meditate on it even more and lose sight of that fact. It's amazing how much I have to be reminded of the gospel, given how amazing the news is. But yes, to me, Christianity still makes sense, a whole lot more sense than believing that nothing took nothing and made this whole show that we're a part of.
Thank you so much, Bobby. Thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for your transparency, for sure, and also the hope that you've shared. But we will absolutely be linking your book below. It is as someone who has read a lot of apologetic books at this point, having gone to seminary and all that fun stuff, it's a cool spin on an apologetics book. Like, I really, really loved it. Like, this book is really special. And so I'm really grateful that we have it as a resource. And for anyone out there in our audience, if anything in this conversation has resonated with you and you'd like to learn more about these topics in beEmboldened services, including more about our upcoming conference in Tennessee this fall, please go to beEmboldened.com and subscribe here to get notified of our next episode. We'll see you soon.